Well, yesterday I was talking to Rick Cole, and he said that we had a cliffhanger from last week. And I thought he was giving maybe a little. I've appreciated that because he and Fran are teaching this morning, and he said, "Hey, you left us kind of hanging there last week, and we're not going to be in class today." I said, "Well, I think you already know the answer, but because we've been talking a lot as we look at God's the reversal of the curse and the renewal of all things that were lost in the fall. We've talked about for quite some time the resurrection of the body, and we have looked at Old Testament teachings of Jesus, preaching the book of Acts, 1 Corinthians 15 for weeks and weeks, really nailing down, as Paul does in that chapter, why bodily resurrection is a central tenet of the Christian faith and why it must occur for God's plan to overcome death and sin, but also he's talked to us about the nature of the resurrection body to a certain extent in that chapter as well. We've looked at passages through the epistles, and we come today to that question that we're kind of left with, because we understand how bodily resurrection raises a lot of questions, and Paul deals with many of those in 1 Corinthians 15. But I think perhaps the most pressing, certainly from a practical standpoint of where you and I are right now, is when, okay, we get that, but what happens when we die? Okay, we have this new body, our bodies are going to be raised and changed and all of those, so we understand all of that, but what happens when we die? From the very beginning, even when at the beginning of this class and from the beginning of Scripture, when we talked about the creation of man, we took note that God purposefully creates us with two natures that are to be interwoven together, and that is the body and the spirit, that we're made out of dirt, but we're made out of breath, his breath, and that's not that's not just, it's not unimportant, it's not without purpose. That by very nature, that is the way God created human beings. And so we are meant always to be spirits living within bodies. We know that in the fall, both spiritually and physically, we experience death. Spiritually, because we're cut off from God because of sin, and we, as Paul will say in the New Testament, we were spiritually dead. We need to be made alive again. And we also recognize, of course, that physical death enters the world at that point in time as well. And we've talked about both how our spirits are regenerated by the power of the Holy Spirit in the gospel, so that we were once dead and now we're made alive, and that's already happened. By God's grace, the first part of our renewal has already taken place, our spiritual renewal. But at the same time, we recognize that our bodies are lagging behind in that department, and they will die only to be raised incorruptible and glorified at the return of Jesus. So we know what happens to our bodies when we die. We have firsthand experience with that. The question is, what happens to the rest of us? What happens to our spirit? And what's the arrangement here, and what's God's plan? And I have a slide up there that says, what's the intermediate state? Intermediate state is just a term that a lot of people have used for a long time to talk about this. We know what we are now, we know what we will be one day, but now in this in-between time, between physical death and the return of Jesus, this intermediate time, what happens to us? And fortunately for us, this is an area where God has given us some information. Some of it kind of peripheral, and then some of it pretty specific. And I think when we're all done looking at these passages, we have a sense of real confidence about this period of our existence, when this in-between time, a time when we exist absent from our body, but waiting for the resurrection of our bodies. So let's take a look at some of these passages. And the first couple are in the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 23, 39 to 43. Jesus is on the cross, and we read here about the criminals that are being crucified with him. And one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." We're going to get to that last part, and that's really what we're here to talk about. But what do you make of this thief and his thinking and his point of view? What strikes you? And this is kind of off to the side of our study, but I think it's certainly worth noting. What do you, this second thief, the criminal that's talking to Jesus here, what do you make of the things that he's saying?
Well, it seems that he somehow realized that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, because he said, "Remember him when he came into his kingdom."
Sure. So he definitely recognizes that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Jesus is physically, I mean, he's on his way out. He's dying. This is the end. And so there is that would certainly be part of the recognition that the kingdom is, in terms of this context, the kingdom is future. What else strikes you? Yes, Connie?
Well, that he said he's done nothing wrong, so he recognizes who he is and that he hasn't been just blaspheming.
Yeah, he recognizes that Jesus has done nothing wrong, which, I mean, that kind of begs the question, how does he know that Jesus hasn't done anything wrong? So, I mean, we begin to understand that, okay, this guy's got some level of understanding here. This isn't some guy who, I mean, I can't imagine it unless he's learned a lot in the few minutes that they've been hanging on the cross. It would seem that this guy has some sort of background, at least in understanding something about the claims of Jesus. Sharon?
And he also states, "Don't you even fear God?" So he knew that there was a connection between Christ and God.
Yes, as he says to the other person who's dying, "Don't you fear God?" And so he recognizes the connection on some level between Jesus and God, that to essentially strike out at Jesus is to strike out against God, or at least to bear the possible retribution or judgment of God. Anybody else? Yes, Donna?
He recognizes his own faults. He kind of repents in sort of a way that I deserve this, as opposed to saying, no, I was innocent. You can't do this to me. He was being honest, and I think he was being, just repentant and knowing that Jesus didn't have to be.
Yeah, he's honest with his own failings, and he understands that he deserves what he's getting. Absolutely. And all of that is 100% true. Let me ask a couple of questions that I think get us to kind of the next level down on this. What do the apostles think is happening right now?
The end of the kingdom.
What's that?
The end of the
The
kingdom.
end of the kingdom. When Jesus is dead, what does every single person that's following him think about the kingdom? That it's over, that it did not come. How in the world, how in the world does a guy dying on a cross next to a guy dying on a cross say, "Remember me when you come in your kingdom"? He's coming in a kingdom. He's dying on a cross. It's like there is such a disconnect between what's happening in that moment and what this guy says, that it's like, where is he coming from? And on some level, this man has an understanding and faith that it would seem no one else in that moment has. And that to me is kind of phenomenal. Everybody goes home beating their breasts. The apostles hide. They're afraid. It's all over. We thought, remember what the guys say on the road to Emmaus? Oh, we thought he was the one. We thought the kingdom. We thought this. And then you have this thief dying on a cross saying, remember me when you come in your kingdom. I think the faith of this man is so notable. I remember years ago, I'm sorry. I'm a preacher, so I'm putting everything in sermon form, but I remember preaching a sermon on like the greatest faith. And one of the greatest faiths is, I remember talking about him, and I remember talking about the Syrophoenician woman who said, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table. I mean, she has such an understanding of the Messianic kingdom that nobody. This man's faith is absolutely remarkable. Now, what does Jesus say about his soon-to-be whereabouts? Paradise. And he tells this man that he's going to be with him. Okay, in a few minutes, Joseph and Nicodemus are going to come along, and they're going to bury the body of Jesus. And it's going to be put into a tomb. But Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. So when Jesus says you will be with me, what's he talking about? In what sense will Jesus, do you see what I'm, Donna?
Well, Jesus said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit.
Sure.
He'll be with him in the spirit.
Yes, we're talking here about, spiritually speaking, Jesus will be in paradise. His body is going to be in the grave. So we see immediately at death, we know where Jesus' body is. There's no surprise at all. We know that. There's no mystery. But Jesus says to the thief, you will be with me in paradise. And obviously, he's not speaking here of his body, but of his spirit. Now, no more is said in the context about this paradise. The word does appear a couple of times in the New Testament. But interestingly, the Greek word paradise, I think it may only be used 3 times in the New Testament. I'm not sure. I didn't look that up. I know it's used at least 3 times in the New Testament. But it's a Greek word that comes out of the Persian vocabulary. And the Persian word originally meant garden, a place of aesthetic pleasures filled with trees, flowers, fountains. And in fact, when the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew to Greek in the 3rd century BC, this is the word that was used in Genesis 2 to speak of the paradise of Eden. This is in the Greek Old Testament, this is the word for Eden, the paradise of Eden. And Jesus said, today you will be with me in paradise. Paul uses it in 2 Corinthians 12 when he talks about being caught up to the 3rd heaven, and he says that he was in paradise. It's the same word. I don't want to make too much out of that, but Paul says, I don't know if I was in my body or not. I was there, but I don't know if I was literally there in my body or if I was just there somehow, but it was a very vivid experience. And in Revelation chapter 2, verse 7, one of the promises given to the faithful is that they will be in the paradise of God. So when we look at this word that Jesus uses, which is not elaborated on at all in the text, don't you wish he would have said, now let me explain to you exactly what I mean by paradise, but it's there. It provides some kind of a context, though. And without allowing our speculation to run too wild, what do you think when Jesus says to this man, because what he's saying to him is literally true. Today you're going to be with me in paradise. What might we anticipate that would involve when they got there? Just from the word itself. And I know it's a kind of a vague thing, but just
Sounds like a very wonderful place. Paradise is paradise.
it's a great place, isn't it? Yeah, it is paradise. I mean, that's our word, in our English word. It's paradise. It's like, it's hard to get better than paradise. And Donna?
When you explain the word root and the origin and everything, I didn't know that, but I always thought paradise, paramedic, lawyer, it's not quite there. Great, but not quite there. And that's how I
Okay.
always looked at it.
Okay, not quite there. And there's a sense in which that's so very true. I don't know about the etymology of the word or anything like that, but it is spiritual. I mean, I think it's definitely spiritually true. Paradise is not the end. It is not there. He did not say it to the other guy. The other guy will not be in paradise, I don't believe. We'll we'll see the flip side of that in just a minute. Deanne?
He tells him he's going to be with him today, so that says it's pretty immediate, it's not time, you don't wait anywhere.
Yeah, good point. It's immediate. Today. In just a minute. That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that one. That's a good point. John?
I've heard some people try to get around that, the fact that he says it's today, by moving the comma, where Jesus would instead say, truly I say to you today.
Well, fortunately, Greek does not have commas, so we can put it wherever we want to. But that's what you're saying is done. Robin?
I had a Jehovah's Witness tell me that very thing.
Is that right? Oh my! Well, that's a new one on me. That's a new one. Because sure, I can see why they would say that. Yeah. The other part that stands out to me, they're going to be together. Does this man, can we from these words deduce that in the very near future, this man will be consciously and knowingly in the presence of Jesus, spiritually speaking? Yes, we can. Today, you will be with me in paradise. We're going to be there. We're going to be there together. You're going to be with me. That says something about the nature of this life in this intermediate time, that there's fellowship. There's fellowship. There is recognition. And one of the things that, we're not really there yet, but one of the things that comes up about this intermediate, or even in the end with heaven, it's like, well, will we know each other? And if you have that question, that's a legitimate question. I mean, I understand that and it needs to be answered. But let me just say, from kind of a logical point of view, if we don't know each other, what's the point? If we don't have any identity, if we've lost all identity, if there's no connection or fellowship, this is a place of fellowship. This guy's going to see Jesus and know it, and Jesus is going to be with him. And so there's fellowship between them. And I don't know if this is purposeful or not, but the way it comes to us in the language of the text, the way paradise ends up becoming the word in Genesis 2, okay, just making that connection. I'm not saying Jesus is purposefully doing that, but it would sure fit. In these words, Jesus takes us back pre-fall. He takes us back to the Garden of Eden. What was it like? It's paradise. Paradise. Men and God living together. Men and women and God living, man, woman, and God living together in paradise. That sounds like a place I'd like to go.
Sounds like paradise to me.
Yeah, it does. It's hard to find something better. So there's just a lot right there. There's just a lot in the words of Jesus. Anything before we go to the next one? Yes, John.
passage kind of blows a hole in the idea that Jesus went to hell before he died.
Okay.
Sorry.
For the no, that's okay. Since we don't have to go down that road, but it's a good point to bring. If you're aware of the passage, I believe 1 Peter chapter 3 about Jesus going to the spirits in prison and preaching there, a very kind of complex passage. One of the points of view of that passage is that Jesus descended into hell and proclaimed either a second chance or judgment in that realm. And so John's saying this would certainly seem to be that he was not going there. He had another destination. So yeah, that's very true. Take a look at Luke 16. Okay. The rich man and Lazarus. Here's my perspective and presupposition on the rich man and Lazarus, so you'll know where I'm coming from. I believe it's a parable, and I'm not going to give you all my reasons right now. If you want to know later, I've preached on this, but if you want to know it later, I'll be glad to give you my reasons for that. I believe it's a parable, and I do not believe that the main point of the parable is to give details about the intermediate state. I believe the main point of the parable is to teach the lesson that if you don't use your wealth to make friends in the heavenly realms, that you will not have anybody to receive you into those realms when you die and your money is gone. To get that meaning, you have to start back at the beginning of chapter 16 and read the parable of the unjust steward and read all the way through Jesus' teaching in the middle to the Pharisees about money. But I think Luke 22 is basically saying to the Pharisees, you've got it wrong on money, and this is what's going to happen to you. That being said, when Jesus says something, whether it's in a parable or it's in straightforward teaching, even in a parable, Jesus is not going to include things that are not true. He's not going to include things that are not factual. So though it may not be the main point of the rich man and Lazarus, what Jesus says in this passage is true and should be understood that way and taken to be speaking of this in-between time. Very familiar passage, I'm sure. You know about the rich man and Lazarus is poor and the rich man doesn't help him and they both die. Verse 22, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. So, just looking at this account, where does Lazarus find himself? The poor man. Where does he find himself?
Abraham's bosom, which the Jews would understand immediately. He's talking to them, so they have to. Like to the fishermen, he talks about, fishing parables. To these guys, he has to say something that will really strike them in the heart. Abraham, they were big on Abraham.
Okay. Yeah, and he speaks about going to Abraham's bosom, Abraham's side, which would have made an impact, especially on the Pharisees, who definitely trace their importance to being a son of Abraham. And if you're getting into the kind of the parable itself, and how did he get there? Angels carried him there. Angels carried him there. It's interesting, isn't it? I like that. Some of you have heard I may share my family story. I've shared it before about my, well, here I am sharing it already, but I'm going to share it. You've already heard it. You've heard it so many times. In fact, would one of you like to tell the story of my Uncle Reuben? My Uncle Reuben, that I never met because he died when he was 16, was laying in bed dying and had some really interesting sort of premonitions about my grandpa being out in the field. Oh, don't worry, he'll get here in time. And my grandpa got back from the field, and my Uncle Reuben's dying, 16 years old. And he then asked them, the family around the bed, if they could hear the music. And then he asked them if they could see the two that were standing at the foot of his bed. Okay, that's just a story, I understand. Today, I can guarantee you that it would be, for an unbeliever, well, you know, those painkiller drugs, they will make you hallucinate anything you've ever imagined. I don't think my Uncle Reuben was on really strong pain-killing drugs. This was like, I don't know, probably 1935 or something like that. But anyway, that's a story that came down to my family, and having told it here and there, I've been amazed at how many families have stories. That's what happens when we die. But when a believer's experience confirms something that's stated in Scripture, I find it to be quite, it's just quite convincing to me. I know I was already a believer when I heard that story, but it certainly was an affirmation. So he's there at Abraham's side. What might we conclude in this conversation? What might we conclude about the nature of what's going on in this intermediate time? Because Jesus is telling us a story here, but when we look at it and see what's happening, what are some things that must obviously be true? I mean, talking about really simple things here. Don't think I'm not going for something like you.
You can't take it with you.
Okay, you can't take it with you.
There is heaven and hell.
Yeah, there is there is a division, ultimately heaven and hell, that's represented here between Abraham's bosom and torment. There is a division at death. There is an immediate division at death between those who will live forever with the Lord and those who won't. That happens immediately.
It's not like he's being tormented.
Yeah.
God is in torment.
Yes, and there is that immediate difference, because what does it sound like to be at Abraham's side?
Pretty good.
Sounds like it'd be pretty good.
Beats the alternative.
Yes, it does. And do you notice that the rich man is still the rich man and Lazarus is still Lazarus? They're the same people. There's this identity. Our identities do not change at death. And I would add, as we get to, or in resurrection. We are the same. There is, and this remains in a realm of mystery, and I know this is just a parable, but we'll get to it in another passage, the next passage. Somehow, even in the spirit realm, there is some sort of recognition of who people are. And we're not really told how that is, but the next passage will bring that out even more. And so again, it shows this. Lazarus and the rich man continue to have the same identity. There's an immediate distinction between the righteous and the wicked. And though the word Abraham's side is used here, or Abraham's bosom, this is a word picture. It's a descriptive term, just like paradise. Paradise conjures up certain things in our minds as it's meant to do. So does Abraham's bosom. whatever is happening here, we're talking about the same realm, just with different descriptive terms. Ellen?
Even though the rich man nor Lazarus had ever met Abraham, they both recognized him.
Yes, there is a recognition.
They knew who he was.
Absolutely. Right. And that, oh yes, Candy.
I was just gonna say, there's also an awareness of the two sides of it.
Yes, there's an awareness. Lazarus is aware of where he is, of where Lazarus is, of his own need, and seeks some kind of relief for his situation. And he's told that that there's no going back and forth. Yeah. Yes, Betty.
And they're conscious. You know, some people think people are sleeping.
Yes, that's a good one to bring up and kind of push to the side already. They are conscious. Betty refers to something that's called the term is soul sleep. That when you die, you go to sleep, and then when Jesus comes back, you wake up. And honestly, the only thing I'm aware of, and if anybody has further information, share it. The only information I'm aware of that causes some people to say that is when Paul says something like, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Where Paul uses the word sleep to speak of death, as a euphemism for death. From a physical point of view, it might appear somebody's asleep. For those who are asleep in relationship to this world, not all will sleep, but we'll all be changed at the moment, And so the word sleep, I think Paul uses the same term in 1 Thessalonians 4 about those who are asleep in Jesus, that kind of term. And so some have taken that term and say, then our souls must be asleep. And I think actually that seems to be more a reference to what, just kind of I don't want to say, it's sort of a euphemism about physical death, that the body is in a sense asleep because there's no consciousness in the body. But all the passages that talk about this intermediate time all speak of consciousness and awareness. That's a good point. Donna?
I was thinking of the instance where Saul woke up Samuel. He says, "Why have you disturbed my?" I don't know if he said sleep, but he said, "Why have you disturbed me?"
Okay.
That's what probably some people think, and I never really thought about it before. I thought he was just bothered by him, but.
Well, Donna brings up Samuel talking to Saul, like, "Why did you disturb me?" And I know that most people who've come to class week after week think that Donna is a plant in class to hit the transitions for me, because the very next passage on your list, well, first of all, it's Matthew 17, and I didn't put it on the slide, but 2 Samuel 28, which is the passage that Donna is mentioning, but it fits right here with Matthew 17, and so I think Donna got her cue just right as usual. Every once in a while, she's just like, 30 seconds ahead of where I want to be. But 17, Matthew 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Oh, we'd like to go on and just do the whole story, and Peter putting his foot in his mouth once more, but let's just stop right there. And a story like it, let's go ahead. I think I have the passage. And in the notes, I think it may say 2 Samuel 28. It's actually 1 Samuel 28. But this is where Saul goes to the medium at Endor, trying to get some kind of word about his future as he's getting ready to go into battle against the Philistines. And he asks her to call up Samuel from the grave. And in verse 11, the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." She's a little upset because there's like penalty of death to do what she just did. The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a God coming up out of the earth." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he's wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. What might we take away from these stories? I know we can't take these too far. These are, I can't think of another moment in Scripture that's like these two moments, where people who are deceased make an appearance. And what might you take? What comes to mind about that?
Two worlds converging.
Two worlds converging. That's definitely taking place. Alan?
So, and I've wondered this before, how did they recognize him?
Good question. How do they recognize him? How do they know? Because they know it's Moses and Elijah, because they understand the significance of who these men are, and they want to honor them. Moses, the law, Elijah, the prophets, with Jesus and Peter, hey, let's build, one for you, one for, it's like they know who these people are, which I guess the answer to that question is, I think, for me, is I have no idea how they recognize them. Is this simply the work of God in this moment as these two worlds come together to give some sort of identifying characteristic, or should we kind of extrapolate from that, and it's probably more where I would tend to go, that in the spirit realm there is personal recognition. Somehow there is still personal recognition even apart from our physical bodies. Eldon?
Well, it seems to me like this was, in the case of Paul going to them, this was something that happened in that day and time more often. Otherwise, how would Paul know that there was a person that he could go to that could bring up the dead? So it must have been a practice that was common or something in that time.
There certainly was a common practice of going to people who could bring the spirits of the dead. There still is.
Well, yeah.
There always has been, hasn't
still
there?
Is.
There always has been. And then the question we grapple with is it real or is it not real? And I have my own view of that. Well, it's a little complex question to answer. There are certainly evil powers and demonic powers at play in the spiritual realm, but there's also, there is a God. God has a sovereignty over the spirits of the deceased. I think if anything happens along that line, it's because God wills it and allows it. This isn't I think the spirits are not something beyond His control. This woman seemed, I always found this. It's kind of weird to call this story humorous, but it seems to me like the most surprised person in this story is the lady who actually did it. It's like, whoa, this is happening. It's almost like, hey, I'm not doing like the raising table and the candlestick flying across the room today. This is the real deal. It's like, what's going on here? You notice how shocked she is that something's actually happening. So I don't know, but there was definitely that belief. And that belief is there. That belief is still here. So it definitely does point that the belief existed.
That all along she knew it was all a fake, but then when it became real by an act of God, it took her by surprise.
That's how this story reads to me. When I read this account, it sounds like she's the most surprised person in the room. But that's. Narratives are that way. You read it and then you reflect on it and you think about it as it relates to other scripture. But you definitely have that. You definitely have that happening here. Now, one of the things. Go ahead, John.
We left the parable in Luke yet. Have we decided anything that we made some conclusions? For one thing, if we're to infer some facts from there, we're judged at death. Our destination is determined at that point.
Yes.
For what were the rich man and Lazarus judged? It wasn't because the rich man was rich and lived lavishly, or that Lazarus was just poor. We really can't take much from their acts before their death, their life.
Well, this is where we're a minute late. Talking about a cliffhanger. Let me just say in a brief answer, believe the answer is in Luke 6. There's no way. I would gladly give I can at least give a 5-minute answer to that question. I mean, in a real condensed form, but not right now. That will be where we start, and then we'll move on to finish this up. 2 Corinthians 5, like 1 Corinthians 15, is like the chief text on the intermediate state. We started with 1 Corinthians 15 because it was the chief text. We're going to end almost with 2 Corinthians 5. In the meantime, I want to leave you with this question. I want you to start thinking about heaven and eternal life. And if possible, make an actual list of the things that you think and believe about what that life is going to be like. What if someone were to say to me, tell me about heaven. What is it? Where is it? What's going to happen there? What are we going to do? All of those questions. I'd like you to make your own literal list. You don't have to show it to anybody else, but I'd like for all of us to go through this exercise. What do we presently think that we understand and know about heaven? Because we're just at the end of this worksheet. That's the next jump. So please, I'd like you to be thinking about it now. Mike?
I think that paradise is a wonderful place, but heaven is better.
Yes.
So it's progression. Look forward to.
That's a great We'll pick that up next week. Thanks.